I thought she was a slave. That's how it started, the mistake that unraveled everything I thought I knew about freedom, honor, and love. I walked into that dusty little outpost on Halaran 7 looking for fuel, maybe a cold drink, and no more than a few minutes of human, or non-human, interaction. I was tired, sore from my last salvage run, and still shaking off the heat from my ship's failing coolant system. What I found instead was a girl with silver eyes and violet skin, standing behind a counter with bracelets that glowed faintly at her wrists. I'd seen tech like that before. Slaver tech. Biometric control bands, used on outer rim colonies to keep indentured workers compliant. I hated those things. Hated what they represented. So, without asking, without even thinking, I drew my tool and sliced through them. They hit the counter with a soft clink. That's when she started crying. Not the way you'd expect someone to cry when they've been freed. Not with relief. Not with joy. She looked at me like I'd just burned down a temple. Her hands clutched her bare wrists, trembling, her entire frame shaking with a pain I hadn't anticipated. "You weren't supposed to do that," she whispered. Her voice cracked with something I didn't recognize at first, grief, maybe. Or shame. "Now you have to marry me." The room fell silent. A few locals turned to stare. My mind raced to catch up. I tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but nothing came out. She was already on her knees, head bowed, performing some sort of ritualistic gesture with her hands over her heart. Not as a threat. Not for show. It was real. Later, I would learn what those bracelets actually meant, sacred bands tied to a Halaran woman's vow of purity. Worn by those waiting for their one true bond. Ancient, cultural, symbolic. Cutting them wasn't just rude. It was a declaration. A claim. Unintentional, yes, but the act had been made. In her eyes, and in the eyes of her people, I had spoken for her, reached for her spirit. And now, by every law and tradition of her world, we were to be joined. I could have run. I almost did. I had every reason to climb back into my ship and forget I ever landed on this god-forsaken rock. But something in her eyes, something unspoken, deep and quietly defiant, held me still. I thought I'd set her free. But maybe, just maybe, she was about to set me free in return. Not from shackles or codes or contracts, but from myself. I've made a lot of decisions in my life, some calculated, some reckless, most of them somewhere in between, but none ever changed my life quite like the moment I saw her. It was supposed to be just another pit stop. My ship was low on fuel, my rations were down to nutrient paste, and I hadn't had real sleep in 2 days. Halaran 7 wasn't even on my planned route, but a coolant leak forced me to reroute through the outer moons. The settlement looked half abandoned from orbit, more dust than infrastructure, a skeleton of civilization baked under twin suns. I figured I'd be in and out in 20 minutes. Grab supplies. Recalibrate NAV, leave without having to talk to anyone. I should have known better. The universe has a funny way of throwing you off course exactly when you think you've got everything under control. The outpost smelled like heat and rust, stale oxygen, and recycled water. A few traders loitered around, their eyes heavy with suspicion. I kept my helmet clipped to my belt to avoid unnecessary attention and headed straight to the supply counter. That's when I saw her. She moved with precision. Graceful but focused. A young woman, maybe mid-20s if I translated her species aging correctly, organizing canisters of hydrogen fuel and scanning inventory tablets with a quiet kind of intensity. Her skin was the soft shimmer of dusk, like violet stone warmed by sunlight, and her silver eyes held the kind of depth that made you feel small just looking into them. But it wasn't her beauty that froze me. It was the way her wrists were bound. 2 bands of intricate metal encircled them, delicate in design but unmistakably advanced. Microfilament sensors, etched circuitry, a faint humming glow. They weren't decorative. I'd seen enough in my years as a soldier and salvage runner to recognize tech like that. They looked like control devices. Restraints. The kind used to mark ownership. Track vitals. Control behavior. I'd seen them on children in the mining camps of Eros Delta, on prisoners of war during the Orion sieges. I'd removed them from corpses more times than I care to admit. My stomach turned. I didn't stop to think. Didn't ask. I just acted. I stepped forward, activated the precision cutter in my glove, and before she could flinch or speak, I severed the first band. It fell with a faint metallic whisper against the counter. Her eyes widened in shock, not fear. Confusion. Her hand flew to the bracelet still intact. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I leaned in, speaking low, trying to sound calm. "You're free now," I said. "You don't have to wear those anymore." Then I cut the second one. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. The air seemed to press in around us, thick with something I couldn't name. She didn't move. Didn't thank me. She stared at her wrists as if I'd carved pieces of her soul away instead of metal. Then, slowly, she looked up. And she began to cry. Not loud. Not messy. Just silent tears rolling down her cheeks, her lips trembling as she struggled to breathe evenly. The kind of cry that came from somewhere deep. A place even language couldn't touch. "You don't understand," she whispered. "What have you done?" I felt my pulse stutter. I thought you were being held. That you needed. They were my promise bands," she said, voice barely audible. "You've claimed me." I didn't understand. Not then. Not fully. Not until the others in the outpost turned to stare. Not until the tall man behind her, older, same skin tone, same eyes, stepped forward with a look of furious disbelief and murmured something in their native tongue. I asked what was going on. I asked why everyone was looking at me like I'd just proposed to their daughter. And then she explained. In her culture, those bracelets were sacred. Not control devices, but symbols. A declaration of purity, yes, but also of intent. They weren't placed on her by someone else. She had chosen them. Worn them. Maintained them with pride and purpose. They represented her vow to wait for the one person she would give her life to, spirit, body, mind. To cut them was not just to damage a custom. It was to override her choice. To declare myself as that person, in front of witnesses. The act, regardless of intention, was binding. There were laws, traditions, ceremonies, and consequences. I didn't say anything. What could I say? I hadn't meant to disrespect her. I thought I was doing something right. Noble. Merciful. That old soldier reflex kicking in again, see injustice, cut it loose. But mercy without understanding is just arrogance wearing a cape. The worst part wasn't the public attention. Wasn't the older man demanding reparations. It was the look in her eyes. like I had taken something from her that she wasn't ready to give. Something she had been protecting her entire life. And still, she didn't lash out. She didn't curse me, didn't scream. She stood with a quiet dignity, even through the tears, and said, "You did not mean harm. That is clear. But our ways do not wait for intent. They answer only to truth." That's when I realized this wasn't going away. This wasn't a misunderstanding I could walk away from or pay off with a few credits. I had crossed into something ancient, something sacred. And in doing so, I'd changed both of our lives. I had tried to set her free. But maybe I was the one who needed saving. They called it the binding promise. I called it a cultural disaster. After I accidentally cut her bracelets, Halaran and I were ushered into a private chamber behind the trading hall. The air inside was thick, like it carried the weight of centuries of expectation. I didn't know what to expect. A lecture? A fine? Maybe a diplomatic slap on the wrist. Instead, I sat across from an elder whose eyes seemed carved from moonstone, her voice like sand brushing across stone, and listened as she explained exactly what I had done. "You have not disgraced her," the elder said, hands folded with quiet gravity. "You have accepted her." "No," I replied quickly, too quickly. "That's not what happened. I thought she was. Look, where I come from, bracelets like that mean something else. Control. Enslavement." I was trying to help. The elder studied me in silence for a long moment. Then she gestured to Halaran, who sat beside me, her posture rigid but not cold. Her face was unreadable, and that unsettled me more than any accusation ever could. I couldn't tell if she was angry, ashamed, afraid, or worse, disappointed. "Intent does not alter tradition," the elder said. "On Halaran, action is sacred. And your action was witnessed." "But I didn't know," I said, my voice thinning under the weight of so many eyes. "And yet the bracelets are gone," Halaran whispered, not accusing, just stating a fact, like pointing out that the sun was hot. "I wore them since I was 15. They were made by my mother, passed down from her mother before her. Each mark, each etching, carries a part of my lineage. I wore them to remind myself of the path I chose. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it. I couldn't find a single word that didn't sound like an excuse." She looked down at her bare wrists. The skin where the metal had rested was still slightly lighter, untouched by sun, perfectly smooth. Her fingers grazed the spot where the bracelets had once sat, as if she could still feel their weight. "There are only 3 ways the promise bands may be removed," she said softly. "First, if the wearer chooses to remove them herself, as a sign of readiness to bond. Second, in ritual, before the bonding ceremony. And third, if the chosen one removes them, publicly, in full view, thus accepting the sacred obligation." My chest tightened. But I didn't accept anything. She turned to me then. Really looked at me. "But you did, Kael. In front of half the settlement. In silence. Without asking. And in our culture, that silence speaks louder than any vow. It was like being accused of a crime I didn't even know existed. But what made it worse was the fact that I couldn't undo it. There was no tech to reverse a gesture. No contract to shred. The bracelets were cut. The people had seen. The ritual had begun. I stood up, pacing the room, the knot in my stomach growing with every step. So what now? What happens next? "We have a wedding." The elder didn't smile, didn't frown. There is no coercion. The path must be completed willingly. But until it is resolved, by union or annulment, you are bound to one another in the eyes of Halaran. I turned back to Halaran. She hadn't moved. Is that what you want? She shook her head, but not in denial. What I want no longer matters the same way. The moment you cut the bracelets, it became about both of us. My choice is now entwined with yours. It wasn't anger in her voice. It was something much harder to face, disappointment woven with grace. She wasn't blaming me. She was accepting the burden of my ignorance with a dignity I didn't deserve. And that, somehow, made me feel smaller than if she'd screamed. I sank back into my chair, dragging a hand down my face. Back home, things don't work like this. Vows are spoken, signed, registered. We fall in love, sometimes recklessly, sometimes too fast, but we get to choose. This feels like a trap. She looked away, and her voice dropped. We choose to. But our choices are made in advance. With intention. We choose by preparing. By waiting. The bracelets were my choice. They weren't for others to interpret. My words caught in my throat. I'd ripped something sacred from her, not out of cruelty, but from a place of assumption, an assumption born of my own world, my own wounds. I'd judged her by my trauma. I'd acted without curiosity. The silence stretched between us, no longer hostile, but heavy with possibility. And regret. Then, quietly, Halaran asked, if you had known, would you have done it? I paused. It wasn't a rhetorical question. She was giving me the chance to say the truth, whatever it was. No, I said finally. If I'd understood what they meant to you, I wouldn't have touched them. Not without asking. I thought I was doing something good. But I wasn't listening. I wasn't even trying to understand. She exhaled slowly, a breath that sounded like a release. Her shoulders softened. That's all I needed to hear, she said. The elder rose, her hands parting gently like the closing of a ceremony. Then the next steps are yours to walk together, or apart. No one forced me to stay. No contract was signed. I could have walked back to my ship, taken off, disappeared into the stars. But I didn't. Because something in me had changed, not from obligation, but from recognition. I hadn't just cut her bracelets. I had stepped into her world, uninvited, and now had a choice to make, leave with my pride, or stay and earn her trust. Not as a savior, but as a man willing to learn what her culture, her promise, truly meant. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure which path would set me more free. I used to think I understood freedom. For most of my life, I defined it as distance, the miles between me and my past, the light years between me and any kind of permanent attachment. I thought freedom meant no roots, no expectations, no one to answer to. I kept moving because standing still felt like sinking. I called it survival. I called it independence. I called it choice. But after what happened on Halaran 7, after I cut the bracelets from Halaran's wrists and was faced with the weight of what that truly meant, I began to understand that maybe I hadn't been free at all. Maybe I had just been running. It took me days to admit that to myself. After the elder released us from that first meeting, there was no immediate wedding. No pressure. Halaran didn't demand anything of me. She returned to her duties at the outpost, and I stayed longer than I planned. I told myself I needed more fuel, that my ship's systems needed recalibrating, that the dust storms were too rough to risk another launch. But the truth was simpler, and far more unsettling. I didn't want to leave. That first evening, I stood on the edge of the outpost platform, watching the twin moons rise over the barren cliffs. The sky here was different than any world I'd visited, denser, layered with stars that shimmered like embers caught in glass. It was beautiful, in that quiet, soul-scraping way. The kind of beauty that made you feel like the universe was trying to tell you something. Halaran joined me, her steps light on the stone. She said nothing at first. Just stood beside me, close enough for her presence to be felt, but not so close that I felt cornered. "I thought you would have left by now," she said eventually. I kept my eyes on the horizon. "I've been telling myself the same thing." She looked at me then, and I could feel it even before I turned to meet her gaze. There was no anger in her face. No resentment. Just calm. Stillness. Like she'd already accepted whatever choice I would make, and wasn't going to try to shape it. "I'm not used to people staying," she said. I let out a dry laugh. Me either. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was spacious, like a room waiting to be filled with meaning. I thought about what she'd said in the chamber. About how her culture saw intention in action. About how the bracelets weren't just jewelry but history, tradition, identity. And I thought about the way she had spoken to me, not with blame, but with honesty. With clarity. She had every reason to hate me, or at least demand some kind of restitution. Instead, she had offered me something terrifying, the space to choose. "I've spent the last 7 years bouncing between outposts," I said. "I used to be a soldier. Then a freelancer. Then a salvager. Always moving. Always keeping just enough distance between me and anything that might ask more of me than I was ready to give." "What were you running from?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I didn't know how to say it out loud. "I was there when the Bastion colony fell," I said finally. "My unit was stationed there for peacekeeping. Just a low-threat mission. At least that's what they told us. Then the riots broke out. Supply lines collapsed. People turned on each other. We tried to help, tried to hold the line, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. Half my team died in the first week. The rest didn't make it out." She said nothing, but she didn't look away. Didn't pity me. That mattered more than I could explain. "I survived," I continued, "because I ran. Because I disobeyed orders, stole a transport, and fled before the final lockdown. And after that, I never stayed anywhere long. I told myself I was too dangerous to be around. That I was a curse. That if I stayed, people got hurt." Halaran's voice was soft, but unwavering. "And now?" I met her gaze. "Now I'm not so sure." She tilted her head, curious. "What changed?" "You," I said. "This place. That moment in the chamber when you looked at me and didn't flinch. When you didn't beg me to stay, or ask me to fix what I'd broken. You gave me space to make a choice. Not out of guilt. Not out of duty. Just because it mattered." She stepped closer then, only slightly, but it felt like a gesture of enormous courage. "We all carry things," she said. "Some visible. Some not. I wore my bracelets to remind myself of what I stood for. What I hoped for. You didn't know what they meant. But maybe now you can choose what they mean going forward." There was a long pause. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant minerals and blooming dust flowers. "I don't know how to be what your people expect," I said. "I don't know your customs. Your language. I don't know how to be a husband, or even if I'm capable of staying in one place long enough to learn." "You don't have to be anything but honest," she replied. "You don't have to stay because the culture says you must. But if you choose to stay, then let it be because you see something here worth choosing." And that was it. No ultimatums. No dramatic declarations. Just truth. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the small guest quarters, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the power core and the occasional whistle of wind outside the walls. I thought about my past, about the weight I'd been dragging with me across the stars. And I realized something that broke me open. I had been searching for freedom in all the wrong places. Freedom wasn't the absence of commitment. It wasn't the ability to leave whenever things got hard. Real freedom, true, soul-deep freedom, was being able to choose someone, something, someplace, not because you were forced to, but because you wanted to. And for the first time in a long, long while, I wanted to stay. It's strange how the most profound journeys don't begin with star maps or launch codes, but with quiet questions, shared silences, and the slow, unsteady rhythm of understanding another person. After the bracelets, after the talk with the elder, after the storm of assumptions had passed, I didn't leave. I stayed. At first, I told myself I was still making up my mind, weighing my options. But the truth was simpler. I wasn't done learning about her. And maybe, if I was being honest, I wasn't done being seen by her either. Halaran didn't try to convince me of anything. She didn't build bridges out of obligation or pressure me to follow tradition. Instead, she invited me, gently, consistently, into her world. Not with words, but with presence. With patience. And that kind of invitation, the quiet kind, is the hardest to ignore. The outpost wasn't much to look at, but it lived. It breathed in a way that felt organic, communal. The people who stayed here were tied not by blood, but by survival, history, and something else that took me longer to recognize: trust. They trusted each other with the small things: water rations, mechanical repairs, fresh fruit delivered from the high cliffs. That trust extended to Halaran. When she walked through the dusty corridors, people nodded with respect. Not because of who she was destined to be, but because of who she already was. They saw her as capable, steady, kind. I wanted to see that too, not from a distance, but up close. So I asked her questions. At first, only the easy ones. What's this fruit called? What does that symbol mean on the wall? Why do the lights flicker at night in the west wing of the station? She answered each one without pause, but never over-explained. She let the questions come as I was ready to ask them, and I think she understood that I wasn't just asking about her world, I was trying to find a place in it. Eventually, the questions deepened. Do you ever wish you'd left this planet? Did you always plan to wait for someone? Do you regret wearing the bracelets? One night, she took me to the rooftop observatory, a half-finished dome built from scavenged glass panels and ancient stargazing equipment. It was her personal project, tucked away from the rest of the outpost. She had aligned the panels by hand, setting each one to reflect the twin moons in perfect balance. Inside, the air was cool and dry, and the stars felt close enough to touch. This was my mother's idea, she said, adjusting one of the tracking lenses. She said if we couldn't travel the stars, we could at least learn their names. Did you ever want to leave? I asked. All the time, she said without hesitation. But I stayed because someone had to. After my parents died, it felt like the right thing. And then the right thing became the only thing. I sat beside her, watching as she adjusted the dials with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She didn't look like a prisoner of duty. She looked like someone who had found meaning in it. I think that's what I never understood before, I admitted. That doing the right thing doesn't always feel like freedom, but it doesn't mean you're trapped either. She smiled softly. And sometimes, the things that look like freedom are just escape in disguise. We spent hours in that dome, mapping constellations, exchanging names for stars. Some of them I recognized from alliance charts. Others were hers, personal, poetic names passed down through her people. The heart of the nomad. The wound that heals. The one who watches. Each name carried a story, and each story made the sky feel a little more alive. Days passed like that. Not with dramatic gestures or declarations, but with moments, small, deliberate, meaningful. We cooked meals together, trading recipes and ingredients. I showed her how to operate the fuel regulator on my ship. She taught me how to brew the calming tea her people drank at dusk. We trained in the combat ring, our movements clumsy at first, then increasingly fluid, like a conversation spoken through muscle memory. She taught me her style, evasive, circular, like flowing water, and I taught her mine, direct and disciplined, a legacy of battlefield necessity. It wasn't romantic in the way I used to define romance. There were no candlelit dinners or stolen kisses under the stars. Instead, it was something deeper. A recognition. A slow shedding of the roles we thought we had to play. She told me stories about her childhood, about racing solar gliders across the salt flats with her brother, about learning sacred songs with her mother before bed, about her first glimpse of the rings of the outermost gas giant through a telescope older than the outpost itself. I told her about the time my commanding officer smuggled puppies aboard our dropship during a 3-week mission just to keep morale up. About how I almost lost my leg during a botched extraction on Virex 9. About the first time I saw Earth from orbit and realized I didn't belong there anymore. Every day, I found pieces of myself coming back. Not the soldier. Not the runner. Not even the man who'd cut those bracelets in ignorance. But the part of me that was curious. Open. Capable of building something, not just surviving in the ruins of other people's plans. One evening, as the desert wind whispered through the outpost and the moons cast long shadows on the sand, I caught her watching me. Not evaluating. Not questioning. Just watching. What? I asked, half laughing. I didn't expect you to stay this long, she said. I didn't expect to want to. That was the beginning of something we didn't name. We didn't have to. It was enough to keep showing up. To keep asking, and listening, and choosing, each day, each moment, to learn one another more fully. The mission had changed. It wasn't about fixing a mistake anymore. It wasn't about atonement or obligation. It was about presence. About choosing to understand before assuming. About building trust where there had once been confusion. And in the process, something else began to bloom, not just between us, but within me. In getting to know her, I was finally learning how to come home. The first time I saw Larry fire a pulse rifle, everything changed. Until that moment, our connection had lived in the quiet spaces, soft conversations, shared meals, side glances held too long in the twilight. I had begun to feel something real with her, something rooted not in obligation but in choice. But it was in danger that I saw the truth of us, when the stakes were higher than love alone, and instinct either deepens or dissolves the bond between two people. It began with a message. I'd left a beacon on the Nomad's long-range comm array, hoping to catch wind of work, and something pinged back, a data retrieval job at a supposedly abandoned mining facility on a moon just a few systems over. It sounded simple. An old contract, overlooked during the consortium's retreat from the region. Just pick up the data core and return it to a client who promised a generous payout. I asked Halaran if she wanted to come. I expected her to hesitate. She didn't. She packed within the hour, moving through the ship with curiosity and ease, as if she'd always belonged there. She strapped herself into the co-pilot seat beside me without being asked. I showed her the controls. She absorbed every word. Her presence changed the Nomad, turned it from a metal shell into something warmer. More human, even if neither of us fully was anymore. The moon was gray and unwelcoming, its surface pitted and lifeless. The mining station, tucked beneath a ridge, showed signs of quick abandonment, lights flickering, doors sealed but not locked. We docked easily, and for the first 30 minutes, everything followed routine. The core was where the briefing said it would be, intact and humming with encrypted energy. But as I detached it from the terminal, a static crackle rang through our comms, followed by a voice I didn't recognize, rough and amused. Well, it said. Looks like the bait worked. Halaran's eyes met mine. No panic. Just clarity. We had walked into a trap. They came fast, 3 figures in scavenged armor, weapons drawn, confidence dripping off their movements. Pirates. Not the petty kind, but professionals. They'd been watching us since we entered the station, waiting for us to retrieve the core so they could steal it. I shoved the core into my pack, turned, and opened fire. The blast lit the corridor, bolts tearing into the ceiling above our heads. Halaran moved without instruction, dropping low, grabbing my sidearm, and covering our flank. She didn't hesitate. Her form was perfect. Controlled. Efficient. Later, I'd learned she had trained with the outpost's militia in secret, back when the threat of consortium raids loomed larger. But in that moment, I only knew one thing: she wasn't a bystander in my world. She was a partner. We fought side by side, our steps coordinated as if we'd done it 100 times. I laid down suppressing fire while she activated a door seal. When a shot grazed my arm, she was already there, pulling me into cover, eyes scanning, hands steady. The bond forged between us in stillness now solidified in chaos. At one point, we were pinned near the loading dock, cut off from the Nomad by a locked blast gate. I was bleeding, pulse hammering in my ears, running on instinct and adrenaline. But Halaran? She was calm. She hacked into the panel using my wrist console, rerouted the circuit manually. Sparks flew. The door groaned open. Move, she said, not pleading, commanding. We sprinted. Energy blasts singed the walls around us. I turned to fire and caught a glimpse of her in motion, elegant, fierce, completely unafraid. We made it back to the Nomad, and before I could reach the pilot seat, she was already strapping in, flipping switches, launching us into the upper atmosphere with a grace I didn't know she possessed. Only once we were safely in orbit did she let out a breath. Not fear. Relief. You were incredible, I said, panting, wiping blood from my arm. She shrugged. I didn't want to die. but her eyes said something else. Something quieter. I didn't want you to die either. That night, after we cleaned our wounds and shut down the ship for rest mode, we sat on the floor of the cockpit, staring out at the stars. I handed her a ration bar, and we shared it like a meal, laughing at how disgusting it tasted. The laughter settled into silence, and the silence into something heavier. We make a good team, I said. We do, she replied, then paused. It felt right. Fighting beside you. It felt like something I didn't know I wanted, I said. She looked at me then, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet understanding I was starting to crave. Her eyes softened, and her voice dropped. I wasn't sure, she said. Not at first. After the bracelets, after everything. I didn't know if what we were building was real. Or just born from pressure and proximity. But today, when I saw how you moved, how you watched my back without hesitation, I knew. Knew what? That I wasn't alone. Not in the way that matters. She reached out then, fingertips brushing mine. It wasn't about romance. Not yet. It was about trust. About something forged under fire and carried into the stillness afterward. In danger, I had seen her, not the girl behind the counter, not the misunderstood figure of tradition, but the woman beneath it all. The warrior. The strategist. The survivor. And she had seen me, not as the drifter, or the man who couldn't stop running, but as someone willing to stay and fight for something other than himself. Love didn't arrive in a confession or a kiss. It arrived in the way we moved as one, in how we bled and bared our fears and still chose each other. It arrived in the fire, and in the silence after it. In the midst of danger, we had found the beginning of something that would outlast even the stars. The Nomad drifted in low orbit above Halaran 7, silent and steady against the canvas of stars. Inside, we stood in the glow of the cockpit's dim console lights, the scars of our last mission still fresh. My arm was wrapped, the wound from the skirmish on the mining moon barely healed. Alari's hands still bore faint bruises from where she'd pried open the docking bay panel during our escape. We hadn't spoken much since returning to the ship. There were injuries to treat, systems to check, adrenaline to wear off, but the quiet between us wasn't empty. It was full of weight. And expectation. For days now, ever since the bracelets, since the accident that had pulled me into her culture and her life, I'd been on the edge of a decision I didn't fully understand. The choice had been pressing in around me, slowly at first, then with the pressure of gravity itself. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about custom or culture or the consequences of a single impulsive act. It was about what kind of man I wanted to be from here on out. I used to think choices were only real if they were made in perfect freedom, I said, my voice low, steady. But that was before I understood what freedom actually is. Alari stood at the viewport, her reflection mirrored in the stars. She didn't turn, but I saw her listening in the way her shoulders shifted slightly, in the subtle motion of her fingers brushing the edge of the window. For years, I made decisions by running from things. From war. From grief. From connection. I thought if I stayed light, unburdened, I could outrun the damage I carried with me. But the truth is, running is a choice too. And I made it so often, I forgot there were other options. Now she turned. Her silver eyes found mine, searching, open. You stayed when you didn't have to, she said. I did, I nodded. But I don't want to stay just because I feel guilty. Or because I broke something sacred. I want to stay because I've seen you. I've fought beside you. I've learned your world. And I can't pretend I'm the same man I was when I first walked into that outpost and assumed I was rescuing someone who never needed saving. The words came more easily now, like a tide that had finally found its current. I came into your life thinking I was doing the right thing. But all I did was take something from you without understanding what it meant. And you didn't rage at me. You didn't force me to make it right. You gave me space. Space to learn, to fail, to choose. And that has changed everything. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until only inches remained between us. Her voice was quiet, but firm. You've already chosen, Kael. Every day you stayed. Every question you asked. Every moment you made room for me. You chose in 1,000 small ways. I looked down at her hands, the same ones that had steadied my aim during the firefight, the same hands that had once worn those bracelets with pride and purpose. Now they were bare, and yet, somehow, more powerful than ever. Then let me choose in one more way, I said, reaching into the pouch at my hip. From it, I pulled 2 new bands, not tech, not traditional. Crafted from scavenged starship alloy, shaped by my own hands with the help of the forge Hilari's uncle kept hidden beneath the outpost's market. They shimmered faintly, brushed with a layer of stardust glass. Simple. Honest. A symbol not of binding, but of balance. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, I said. I don't know how to be a husband in your tradition, or if I ever will. But I do know what I want. I want to keep building this. With you. Not because I broke something, but because I found something worth rebuilding. Her breath caught in her throat. She took one of the bands in her hand, fingers trembling, not with fear, but with emotion held carefully in check. I wore the promise bands to remind myself of the vow I made to wait for something true, she said. When you cut them, I thought that vow was destroyed. But it wasn't. It was transformed. It became something neither of us expected. She held out her wrist. Place it? But this time, not as a claim. As a question. I slid the band over her wrist, the cool metal warming instantly to her skin. She took the second band and did the same for me, her touch lingering, grounding. We stood there in the cockpit, 2 people forged in the collision of cultures, in the fire of danger, in the stillness of choice. Around us, the stars burned indifferent, ancient. But in that moment, something new began. No rituals. No audience. Just a choice made with full awareness, in full freedom. Later, as we returned to the surface, I found myself walking through the outpost not as a visitor, not even as a stranger welcomed back, but as someone changed. The people looked at us differently, not because of some ceremony or title, but because they could see what had shifted between us. What had settled. And that night, beneath the twin moons, I sat with Hilari on the edge of the cliff where the observatory dome overlooked the valley. The wind was soft. The air still. And as she leaned her head against my shoulder, I didn't feel trapped or confined. I felt grounded. Whole. I had made a choice that mattered, not because it was expected, but because it was real. And in doing so, I hadn't lost freedom. I had found a new kind of it. The kind that comes not from cutting ties, but from finding the one person you'd trust to hold them with you. There is a stillness in space that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not the absence of sound, ships hum, systems whir, comms click and flicker with coded pulses, but rather the absence of noise inside you. Out here, floating between stars, with no sky to hang above your head, the boundaries between what you carry and what you are begin to blur. I used to hate that stillness. It reminded me of everything I didn't want to confront. Now, it feels like home. 6 months have passed since I cut the bracelets from Halaran's wrists on a dusty outpost I never intended to land on. 6 months since I mistook a symbol of sacred tradition for an instrument of control. 6 months since I thought I was freeing her, and instead began the slow, unsteady process of freeing myself. Our days no longer follow the same kind of structure they once did. There is no longer the looming question of whether I'll stay. That answer came and went in the quiet act of returning after each mission. Of bringing her back new soil samples for her botanical studies. Of learning her language in whispered phrases between jumps. Of memorizing the way she smiles when I describe Earth's oceans. I never said the words "I'm not leaving," but every action since that day has made the truth clear. We split our time between the stars and the surface now. The Nomad has been refitted for 2 pilots, 2 sleepers, 2 sets of maps and habits and histories. It no longer feels like my ship. It feels like ours. When we're not flying, we live in a modest home carved into the rock above the observatory she once built with her mother's hands. That observatory has become a place of stories and rituals, of late-night stargazing and quiet conversations about the things we've both lost. We've taken on more missions, some dangerous, some routine, but each one reinforces something that never needed to be spoken aloud. She is my partner. Not just in name, not just in combat or planning, but in presence. We speak with fewer words now, but more meaning. The way she glances at me when entering a new system, the way she adjusts the ship's balance to account for the tools she knows I always forget to secure. The way she brushes her fingers across mine in passing, just to remind us both that we're here. Together. There is something deeply humbling about being known. Not admired. Not desired. Not simply tolerated. But known. It means there is no place to hide, no mask, no carefully curated version of yourself that you present to the world. With Halaran, I am not the soldier, not the salvager, not the man running from memories. I am just Kael. And that is enough. I used to define myself by my independence. I thought freedom meant motion, endless forward movement unanchored by expectations or emotional debt. I wore it like armor, convincing myself that never staying long enough to be missed meant I was strong. But I've learned that real strength doesn't come from escaping. It comes from choosing to stay, to build, to repair what has been broken. What I found with Halaran wasn't a prison, and it wasn't obligation. It was a mirror. She reflected back the parts of me I had long since buried beneath duty and grief. She gave me space to relearn them. She never tried to shape me into someone I wasn't, only held space for the person I had the potential to become. That kind of love is rare. Quiet. Steady. And impossibly powerful. It's strange to look back now and realize how close I came to walking away. To imagine a version of this story where I cut her bracelets, misunderstood everything, and vanished into the stars like I'd always done. I would have carried the guilt, of course. Maybe even remembered her name. But I would have missed the life we built in the aftermath of that moment, the life born not from accident, but from intention. People often talk about soulmates like they're fated, like some cosmic hand draws a line between 2 people and leaves them to find each other across the vastness of space. But I think soulmates are chosen. Not found, not assigned, not granted. Chosen. Again and again, in the quiet moments and the loud ones. In the fire and the stillness. In the mess, and the mending. I chose her. And she chose me. Not because we had to. Because we wanted to. Because the version of ourselves that existed together was more whole than the versions that lived alone. And in that choice, I found something I never expected: peace. Not the peace of a war ended or a mission accomplished, but the kind that settles into your bones. The kind that lets you exhale without realizing you've been holding your breath for years. Halaran once told me that in her culture, the stars are seen as witnesses. Not gods, not guides, but watchers. Silent observers of the choices made in their light. That thought used to unsettle me. Now, it comforts me. Because if the stars have been watching, they've seen everything. The mistake. The misunderstanding. The fear. The learning. The love. And I like to believe that in their ancient, unknowable way, they've marked our journey as something worth remembering. We still fight. We still argue. We still lose our tempers and stumble over our differences. But each conflict ends not in separation, but in return. In listening. In reaching for each other again. That is what love has become for us, not perfection, but persistence. The other day, I found the old bracelets she used to wear. She'd tucked them away in a small box lined with soft cloth, not hidden, just resting. I held them in my hands for a long time, remembering the sound they made when they hit the counter, the look on her face, the way my heart stuttered when I realized what I'd done. And then I placed them back where she had left them, not out of shame, but out of reverence. They are not relics of a mistake. They are symbols of where we began. Every night, we return to that observatory. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we sit in silence. Always, we look up. The stars haven't changed. But we have. And in their light, I no longer feel alone. There are stories that entertain, and then there are stories that stay with you, quietly, persistently, because beneath their otherworldly settings and futuristic details, they hold a mirror to our own lives. The tale of Kael and Halaran, set against the backdrop of distant planets, alien cultures, and galactic dangers, may seem like a work of speculative fiction, but at its heart, it is deeply human. It's a story about misunderstanding and redemption, fear and courage, freedom and commitment. And ultimately, it is a story about choice, the power we hold when we choose to understand one another, and the world we build when we choose to stay. Kael thought he was rescuing Halaran. He thought the bracelets on her wrists represented bondage, submission, or oppression. And in that belief, he acted quickly, impulsively, destroying something he didn't understand. This moment of misplaced heroism becomes the central pivot of the story, not because it was evil or malicious, but because it was driven by a lack of understanding. And how often does this happen in our own world? We live in a global society marked by the collision of cultures. We share digital spaces, economies, languages, and ideologies. And yet, misunderstanding is rampant. We interpret traditions we don't understand. We dismiss what feels foreign. We impose our values on others, assuming that freedom must look the same in every culture, in every context. The moment Kael cuts Halaran's bracelets is not just a narrative device, it's a reflection of a very real human impulse, to act before listening, to fix what we think is broken without asking whether it needs fixing at all. From that moment on, Kael is faced with a choice, and this is where the deeper meaning of the story begins to unfold. He could have left. He could have walked away from the consequences of his mistake. But instead, he stays. And in staying, he begins to learn, not just about Halaran's people, but about himself. he learns that real freedom is not the ability to run. Real freedom is found in responsibility, in being present, in choosing love and meaning even when it feels inconvenient or difficult. This theme resonates powerfully in our modern world. We are constantly fed the message that freedom means escape from relationships, from expectations, from traditions. But true maturity comes when we understand that commitment is not the enemy of freedom, it is its highest form. Choosing to remain, to listen, to work through discomfort, to repair what we've unintentionally broken, this is the work of becoming fully human. Halari's strength is quiet, but profound. She doesn't retaliate or seek vengeance for Kael's ignorance. Instead, she offers him the opportunity to learn, and more importantly, the space to choose. Her culture values action, not intention, a concept that challenges Kael's worldview, and perhaps ours as well. We often excuse ourselves by saying we meant well, as though good intentions can erase harm. But intent is not impact. Halari's grace lies in her ability to hold Kael accountable without punishing him, to invite growth without demanding penance. Her wisdom is a reminder that forgiveness is not weakness, and that strength often looks like patience and dignity. Together, Kael and Halari build something that neither of them anticipated. What began as a cultural misunderstanding blossoms into genuine connection, through shared labor, mutual respect, and the slow, intentional act of knowing one another. Their love is not born from romance in the traditional sense. It is not swept up in fantasy. It is forged through conflict, through truth, through trial. And because of that, it is real. There's something incredibly hopeful in that idea. That love doesn't have to begin perfectly to become something beautiful. That people who come from different worlds, literally and metaphorically, can find a common rhythm, if they are willing to do the work of understanding. In a time when polarization and division define so much of our discourse, this story reminds us that unity doesn't come from sameness. It comes from a shared willingness to bridge the gap. The sci-fi elements of the story serve as an amplifier, not a distraction. The alien world, the technology, the space travel, they heighten the stakes, but they also provide a backdrop against which human truths are revealed with startling clarity. In many ways, speculative fiction allows us to explore real human dilemmas with fresh eyes. We are more willing to examine prejudice, tradition, gender roles, and power dynamics when they're dressed in alien skin. But underneath the setting, the emotional and ethical core of the story remains deeply relevant to the lives we live here and now. Perhaps the most powerful lesson in this story is about choice. Kael does not stay because he is forced. He stays because he recognizes the value in choosing responsibility, in choosing connection. And Halari, too, chooses. She chooses to forgive. She chooses to trust. And eventually, she chooses to love, not because it was written in law or tradition, but because she saw something real in him. Together, their choices shape a future that neither of them could have built alone. In the end, what makes this story resonate isn't the alien setting or the plot twists. It's the way it challenges us to rethink what it means to be free, to be connected, to be human. It reminds us that we are all capable of misunderstanding, but also of learning. That our most painful mistakes can become the foundations of our most meaningful relationships, if we are willing to take responsibility for them. It's a story about how love is not just something we feel, but something we do. Something we build, moment by moment, choice by choice. And that perhaps the greatest adventure we can embark on is not across galaxies, but toward one another. So if this story leaves you with anything, let it be this: that every person you meet carries a history you don't see. That every tradition has roots you may not understand. That your intentions, no matter how noble, must be matched with humility, curiosity, and the courage to listen. And that real love, whether romantic, familial, or communal, is not about finding someone who fits into your world, but about building a new world together, piece by imperfect piece. In a universe full of stars, what matters most is the one you choose to orbit with.